At what point do you take it upon yourself to make things right because things are so bad that no one even notices anymore? How bad do things have to get before you're forced to make people wake up? I'm going to be talking about two things today: the movie Seven and the concepts behind the 7 deadly sins. I want to do a deep dive into each one so that you can understand the motives behind the character played by Kevin Spacey, who in the movie goes by the name of John Doe. We're going to get into some dark themes, some theology, some philosophy, and some of my own personal theories. First, I want to be upfront about something. I am not a theologian or a historian or a philosopher. I just like talking about movies, and I want to show you exactly what the 7 sins are. I'm not preaching or casting judgment. Trust me, I'm the least qualified person to judge anyone. I say all that because in the movie, there's a few sources the detectives use in order to get a better idea of who John Doe is and try to get into his mind. And what I want to do is intertwine those sources and go through every sin and every victim in the movie. One of the source materials John Doe was reading in the movie was the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was a 13th century philosopher and theologian who had a major influence on Western thought and Western ethics. He saw sin as a voluntary word, deed, or desire contrary to eternal law. Out of John Doe's reading material, I thought this one was the best at explaining what the sins are and why they're considered the 7 deadly sins. Other reading material John Doe used that I wanted to go over is Dante's Divine Comedy, which also talks about these sins. But first, let's start with what exactly is sin? You'll get different answers from different people, but I think the most common understanding is the human act of doing something bad. John Doe seems to view sin as a moral decay that's become so trivial to the point that people don't even notice it anymore. I think this view is actually something that comes from the screenwriter of the movie Seven, Andrew Kevin Walker. What inspired him to write the movie were his own experiences and observations when he moved to New York City in the 1980s. You see, in the 80s, crime was rampant in New York City before the crime rate started to drop in the 90s and throughout the 2000s. That exposure to crime must have led to creating this cynical character we see in John Doe. He reminds me a little of the Underground Man in Dostoevsky's novel Notes from the Underground. Just a guy who sees humans as corrupt and meaningless while living in isolation and becoming more bitter by the day. That actually sounds a lot like people on the internet. The movie, though, doesn't take place in New York City. Or maybe it does. To be honest, the name of the city is never actually mentioned. It was filmed in Los Angeles, but I think not mentioning the city is supposed to remind the viewer that this could be any city. The movie is gritty. I mean, it feels like a David Fincher film. But more than that, this movie really just fills the viewer with dread and hopelessness. It's constantly dark and it's raining. It's like the entire environment reeks of death and everything you see looks like it's been tainted the way sin taints a soul. But there's so much of it that it starts to go unnoticed. It's just part of the city we're looking at. Or maybe I'm just over-romanticizing a movie I like and it's really not that deep. I don't care. Art is subjective, and that's how I see it. And I think that's how John Doe sees it. Nobody notices what's going on around the city, so it just becomes tolerated because it's just how things are. And this is what gets to him. He wants people to notice it. John Doe sees sin as something that needs to be punished to its fullest extent. And in his view, people are just beyond saving. The theological view of attrition is feeling sorrow for one's own sins. John Doe thinks people are so far gone that attrition needs to be forced. In his words, wanting people to listen, you can't just tap them on the shoulder anymore. You have to hit them with a sledgehammer. In fact, John Doe doesn't believe in redemption, not even his own. More on that later. And yes, there's going to be heavy spoilers throughout this video. So before we dive into John Doe's victims and the sins he believed they committed, we need to know what the 7 deadly sins are and why these in particular. In the 6th century, there was a revised list that listed the 7 deadly sins in order from least to most severe. Those sins are lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. Now note, this is not the order that's used in the movie, but don't worry. We'll go through each one as we go through the victims of John Doe, and as we do that, I thought it would be interesting to draw from St. Thomas Aquinas' views on these sins, but also from Dante's Divine Comedy that I mentioned earlier. Dante's Divine Comedy is not an official teaching in any church, but rather a piece of Italian literature that was heavily inspired by Thomas Aquinas. It's divided into 3 parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. I'll be focusing on Purgatorio, which is where Dante talks about the 7 deadly sins. In Purgatorio, there are 7 layers on Mount Purgatory that represent each one of the 7 sins. As we go through the movie, I thought it would be cool to see where each victim would land according to Dante. Again, this isn't an official teaching anywhere. The Divine Comedy is a poem, and much of it was inspired by Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. In the Summa, Aquinas refers to the 7 deadly sins as capital sins because these are the sins that other sins frequently come from. For example, if someone were to lie to another person in order to swindle them out of money, the sins committed would be lying and stealing, but the capital sin would be greed. Okay, so now that we have an idea of where John Doe's mind is and some of what he's been reading, we can start to take a look at each one of his victims. The first victim we see is an unnamed, morbidly obese man who's chained to a dinner table like a wild hog to a fence post, with his head buried in a plate of pasta. This is the scene where the 2 protagonists of the film, Detective Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman, and Detective Mills, played by Brad Pitt, come in. The autopsy shows bruises on his head, and we later find out that John Doe forcefully fed this man until his stomach expanded to the point where it finally burst. I mean, there's been times I overate and I felt like I was going to implode, but this is on another level. Believe it or not, this is actually one of the more tame executions in the movie. It gets worse. It's later revealed that behind the back of the fridge, John Doe wrote the word gluttony in grease. According to Aquinas, gluttony isn't just the desire for food or drink, but the unnecessary desire for it. A desire so extreme that it becomes a disordered attachment to food that distracts the soul from reason and virtue. This is why he explains that overeating accidentally isn't gluttony, but rather knowingly doing it. Not just finding pleasure in food, but using food only for pleasure. Let me pause for a second just to reiterate. I'm not trying to preach or make anyone feel guilty or tell anyone that they're sinning. That's not the purpose of any of this. I'm just tying these concepts from St. Thomas Aquinas and Dante into the movie. In Dante's Purgatorio, gluttony is terrace number 6 on Mount Purgatory. The people here are punished with starvation and thirst. They're having the exact opposite experience they were having on Earth. Here, in Purgatory, there's fruit trees everywhere, but the gluttonous aren't able to eat from them. And again, Dante is a poet. He's not a theologian or a clergy member. His writings aren't official beliefs or teachings, but rather one long poem with very religious and philosophical themes. On gluttony, he writes, "The nose is for the wine, the tongue for taste, and nature, bound in pleasure, goes to waste." He's saying in a very poetic way that people can become slaves to food and drink, or in this case, a plate of spaghetti. The next victim is found the following day. His name is Eli Gould, and his sin was that he was a lawyer. Kill the lawyer! No, his sin is greed, and on the floor of the crime scene, it's written in blood. What makes his case particularly gruesome is that John Doe, being the sadist that he is, made Gould cut a pound of his own flesh as punishment for his greed. This act of brutality is actually Shakespearean. John Doe's inspiration for it came from Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice, where a merchant named Antonio borrows money from a lender named Shylock. Shylock agrees to lend the money interest-free under one condition. If Antonio defaults on the loan, he has to pay with a pound of his own flesh. In the play, Antonio defaults on the loan, but Shylock loses his case on a technicality, and Antonio gets away literally scot-free. Eli Gould, on the other hand, isn't so lucky. This is how you can tell John Doe, while methodical, really is just drawing inspiration from anywhere, and really is sadistic. In the play, Shylock is the greedy one, not Antonio, so it looks like John Doe picked this method of justice for his own twisted pleasure. Greed is one of those things that seems pretty self-evident. Aquinas describes it as the immoderate desire of possessing, the key word here being immoderate. He pulls various passages from biblical scripture like Ecclesiastes, where it says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money." Because of this unquenchable thirst for material possessions, Aquinas believes greed leads to other sins like fraud and perjury. Back on Mount Purgatory, Dante has greed as the fifth terrace just above gluttony. Here, Dante decided the punishment for the greedy is they have to lay face down on the ground, unable to move. The ground represents earth and earthly possessions, which mean nothing here. They're face downward so they can continue their fixation on earthly nothingness. And they can't move because, just like it was when they were alive on earth, their greed paralyzed them, spiritually speaking here. And speaking of fixations, Mills and Somerset are dialed in, looking anywhere for clues, and they find one. A big one. I don't know much about detective work, but I'm guessing one of the biggest clues you could discover are fingerprints, and that's exactly what they find. It seems John Doe not only left behind fingerprints, but did so deliberately, and after running the prints, they find a match. The police have their guy, Theodore Allen, aka Victor, a former client of Eli Gould, the lawyer we just got done talking about who had to give up a pound of flesh. This guy has a long criminal rap sheet, but Mills and Somerset don't seem too confident that this guy is the guy they've been looking for. Somerset feels like their guy had more purpose than just some dope peddling child abuser, which is what Victor is. But nonetheless, they go to Victor's home, knock on his door, and they're ready to arrest the guy and put this whole thing to bed. But before they can do that, they need Victor to get out of bed. Literally. He's under the covers, and if he makes one wrong move, SWAT is ready to turn him into a corpse. Only that's not necessary because when the covers are pulled off, that's exactly what they see. A corpse. Victor just went from main suspect to victim number 3. Only he's not a corpse. He's alive! He's alive! Victor is just barely alive. John Doe, being the methodical psychopath he is, kept Victor alive for an entire year, meaning he's been planning all this much longer than we originally thought. This to me added a layer of eeriness and malevolence to John Doe, as if his previous 2 acts weren't evil enough. He was tortured every single day for an entire year. It's psychologically the most disturbing part of the entire case. To calculate the exact amount of nutrition he would need so that he could stay alive while simultaneously decaying, all while being strapped to his bed just so John Doe could showcase him as being the ultimate sloth. That was Victor's sin. Most people equate sloth with being lazy. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas has a deeper view on this. He sees it as a sluggishness of the mind that prevents people from finding joy in acts of love and charity. Instead of finding them to be virtuous, the mind of a sloth views them as a burden. It's a separation from spiritual goods that keep people from prayer and seeking God. Aquinas argues that this lack of acting in love and charity robs a person of their joy, and that joy gets replaced with malice and bitterness. This is why he thinks it's one of the 7 deadly sins, or as he calls it, a capital sin. He believes sloth leaves the mind open to hatred and invites vices into one's own thoughts. Dante placed sloth on the 4th terrace of Mount Purgatory. He believed that love should drive all actions and saw sloth as an apathetic spiritual paralysis. Because of this, in Purgatorio, those on the 4th terrace were forced to run around the terrace without rest while shouting out examples of zeal to each other. It's the physical inverse of what they were mentally doing on Earth, but taken to the extreme. The souls here are worried about wasting any time on sloth. Before we get to the next victim, we have a scene where Somerset goes over to Mills's house for dinner after being invited by Mills's wife Tracy, who's played by Gwyneth Paltrow. We get to see a more human side of both Mills and Somerset, and for the first time, they actually seem to be enjoying each other's company. Tracy seems to be the person that's able to bring these two personalities together, and you can tell during this scene she admires something about Somerset. But I mean, it's Morgan Freeman, so the guy just has this charming demeanor, but it plays well in the scene. Later that week, she actually calls Somerset because she wants to meet with him privately. I remember watching this the first time and thinking, is she really about to have an affair with Somerset? Is this girl really going to cheat on Brad Pitt with Morgan Freeman? Well, no. It turns out she just doesn't have anyone to talk to because she doesn't know anyone, and she's keeping a secret from her husband. Tracy is pregnant. She's pregnant, and she absolutely hates the city they live in. She sees everything John Doe sees, just moral decay everywhere. She can't imagine bringing a child into the world, and Somerset empathizes with her. He went through something similar and decided not to keep the baby. He mentions that he knows he made the right decision, but there isn't a day that goes by that he wishes he had made a different choice. I don't know why, but that line always stuck with me. Somerset tells Tracy that if she decides to keep the baby, to never tell Mills about it. But if she does decide to keep it, to spoil it every chance she gets. Tracy's pregnancy actually plays a pivotal role towards the end of the movie. Back at the office, Mills and Somerset are trying to come up with a game plan to get inside John Doe's head and try to figure out his motivation. Mills mentions something about a library, and a light bulb goes off in Somerset's head. You see, certain books get flagged, and what Somerset is trying to do is find someone with a particular set of books, and that's exactly what he finds. Two of the books I already mentioned, The Divine Comedy by Dante and the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. And it's the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas that lead Mills and Somerset to John's apartment. And they couldn't have gotten there at a worse time because John Doe sees them before they see him. And unfortunately for our detectives, John Doe is armed and fires in the direction before taking off. Mills chases after him, but John Doe, as always, is one step ahead. He confronts Mills and has the opportunity to end him right then and there, but instead decides to show mercy. Only as we'll find out later, it's not mercy at all. It's all part of the plan. Mills and Somerset make their way back to John Doe's apartment, and against Somerset's warning, Mills knocks down John Doe's door only to find it's empty. Somerset thinks Mills just ruined this entire case. See, David Mills is a complete hothead. He's constantly losing his temper. This is something that's going to end up costing him everything. But before we get there, I want to talk about a scene where Mills and Somerset are having a drink at a bar and discussing the case. I think the dialogue here is great, and it really just sums up the entire meaning of the film. These two philosophical ideas, one rooted in love and one rooted in apathy. Somerset, over the course of his career, has developed this nihilistic worldview where he sees apathy as a solution to the human condition. And because of this, he wants to quit. He says he understands people and sympathizes with them. How it's easier to lose yourself to vices than it is to cope with life. How it's easier to steal something you want instead of working for it. How it's easier to beat a kid than it is to raise it. Love costs. It takes effort. He thinks Mills is naive, but Mills argues that Somerset's worldview is pessimistic and bleak and that he doesn't really think Somerset believes all that. Mills cares. He cares about people. He thinks John Doe is an anomaly, an insane person. But Somerset thinks John Doe is just a microcosm of a hopeless world with nothing good to offer. But Mills sees the good. He sees the good in Somerset. He thinks that Somerset doesn't want to quit because he believes the things he says, but rather he wants to believe it because he's quitting. And this scene is so good. It's so deep, and it went over my head the first time I watched it. When I first saw it, I kind of just saw Mills as young, naive, an inexperienced cop who thought he could make a difference, and Somerset as the old, jaded detective who was ready to just hang him up. And yeah, there's some of that, but really what this scene does is capture these two conflicting feelings that I think a lot of us have. The feeling of working through love in the face of existential dread. I know you might be thinking it's just two coworkers at a bar having a drink. It's not that deep, but I'm sorry. It is that deep. Anyway, back to John Doe. John Doe's fourth victim is a lady of the night and represents the sin of lust.
She was a hoa.
I'm going to try to tiptoe around this one because this one is pretty graphic. I mean, they're all graphic. This one is just vulgar. Basically, John Doe forces a guy to wear a bladed,
It's a dildo.
to use on a victim, leaving her lifeless in the process. Like I said, vulgar. Not to mention gruesome. Mills and Somerset do some interrogation work to try and get a lead on John Doe, but to no avail. The guy who runs the club where this took place pretty much tells Mills that everyone who comes in there looks suspicious. Meanwhile, Somerset is trying to get information from the guy who John Doe forced to perform this sick deed, but he's still in a state of mental shock and is having a complete meltdown over his participation in what John Doe saw as justified punishment for lust. Lust, according to Aquinas, is a capital sin because it leads to other sins like the sin of adultery. He said lust isn't just a physical destruction, but a spiritual one that disorients the soul, pointing to the book of Daniel where it says, "Beauty has deceived you, and lust has perverted your heart." Aquinas draws a comparison between lust and gluttony, and just how there's nothing wrong with eating, there's nothing wrong with physical pleasure as long as it's in line with divine law. Aquinas also argues that lust comes from despair, and this void left by despair causes people to try and fill it with pleasures of the flesh. Not just pleasure, but a pleasure that is all-consuming. Lust is the seventh terrace of Mount Purgatory in Dante's Purgatorio. Dante described lust as a misguided or misdirected desire that turns excessive. In his story, the souls here are forced to walk through fire, shouting praises of chastity and purity. Dante, as well as Aquinas, saw chastity as the virtue that was opposed to lust. The souls walking through the fire could be a reflection of their burning desires while they were here on earth. On earth, it consumed them, but here, it purifies them. John Doe's next victim is a model who lived a life of vanity, and because of this, John Doe thought it would be appropriate to disfigure her face to the point where she's unrecognizable. Rather than live a life with a scarred face, the model decides that life isn't worth living anymore and chooses a bottle of pills as her escape from this world. She had too much pride to be seen as anything but beautiful, and that was her sin. According to Aquinas, pride is the desire to raise oneself above the reason and order that God allows. It's more than just wanting to be excellent, but overstepping and desiring an excessive amount of it. Even though this is a short scene in the movie, pride is actually the worst of the 7 deadly sins. It's the boasting about things we don't actually have, and despising others and wanting to appear superior. It's considered the worst sin because it's not done out of ignorance or weakness, but out of pure contempt. It's the very first terrace on Mount Purgatorio in Dante's Purgatorio. Here, the proud are bent under giant stones. It's supposed to represent the opposite of them trying to exalt themselves. They're in a state of humility, which is the opposite of pride. Back at the precinct, Mills and Somerset are racking their brains over what they encountered at John Doe's apartment, when all of a sudden, they hear someone yelling to get their attention.
Detective!
It's John Doe, covered in blood. The guy they've been relentlessly chasing just turned himself in, but his work isn't finished. He has something to show the detectives at an undisclosed location. The car ride is one of the most powerful scenes in the movie. It's really fascinating because here you have this trichotomy of worldviews. You have Detective Mills, who represents the common everyday man. He wants justice. He loathes John Doe and sees him as nothing but an evil psychopath. Him and Doe agree that it gives Mills comfort to label Doe as completely insane. To Mills, it's the only thing separating him from John Doe. But that's all about to change at the end of this car ride. John Doe obviously doesn't see himself as insane. He doesn't view himself as special, but he sees his work as special. He says that none of this is something he chose, but rather he was chosen. This line is what stops me from considering that John Doe represents some sort of dark, Friedrich Nietzsche Übermensch character that can just transcend or reject traditional morality. If anything, it seems like the complete opposite. John Doe thinks he was divinely chosen to impose morality with full impunity. Granted, I have a very surface level understanding of philosophy, so if I'm misunderstanding that, you'll just have to excuse my ignorance. Mills might seem like the least intelligent of the three, but the more I watch this movie, the more I seem to agree with him. John Doe is insane, period. Somerset argues that John Doe's stance that he was called by a higher power to carry out judgment is hypocritical because he seems to be enjoying it. To which John Doe responds by saying there's nothing wrong with a man taking pleasure in his work. At this point, Mills questions him and implies that all John Doe does is take the lives of innocent people. John Doe is visibly pissed after hearing this and starts to go down the list of victims and why they got what they deserved. Somerset is sitting there silently taking it all in and has this look on his face like he's almost empathetic to what John Doe is saying. He's not in full agreement. I think Somerset probably agrees with John Doe all the way to the point where John Doe takes it upon himself to carry out what he deems as justice. He's not completely dismissing John Doe the way Mills is. There's a tiny bit of dialogue during John Doe's rant where he mentions taking justice on murderers, and Mills calls him out. He mentions that he's one himself, and John Doe just shouts over him and continues his rant on why his victims deserve their fate. This is just my personal theory on this, but I think that moment really bothered John Doe. Not because he was being interrupted, but because he knew deep down inside Mills was right. We're going to see a little later that John Doe doesn't see himself as better than any of his victims, but rather equal. But in that brief moment, he wasn't just as bad or just as guilty as they were. He was worse. And the shouting over Mills was his way to cope with the fact that he is indeed just an evil psychopath. Insane, unimportant, movie of the week, just like Mills said. Once they're at the location that John Doe's picked out, we see a delivery truck making its way to Somerset, Mills, and Doe. Somerset goes to investigate what's going on while Mills stays behind with John Doe. We are about to embark on one of the most famous twists in the history of cinema. The delivery driver has a package addressed to David Mills. At this point, it could be anything, including a bomb. But Somerset knows John Doe just isn't that type of guy. I don't think he knows exactly what's in the box, but I think he suspects that it's going to be something gruesome. And he's right. He opens the box, and the look on his face is fear, shock, and disgust. And while this is going on, John Doe is trying to get the attention of Detective Mills. Mills keeps dismissing him until John Doe brings up Tracy, Detective Mills's wife. He keeps going on about his admiration for Mills and how his admiration has turned into his deadly sin, envy. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas describes envy as a sort of grief of not having the good they see in another person. Now you might be thinking, who isn't envious of 90s Brad Pitt and Gwyneth Paltrow? I mean, what are we talking about here? Well, Aquinas argued that we actually tend to envy those that are close to us that we consider rivals. So not so much a celebrity, but a friend, a family member, a co-worker, an acquaintance. In John Doe's case, he sees Mills as a guy with an ordinary life who seems to have it all. He has this simple life that John Doe always wanted. Well, as simple as being a homicide detective could be. Aquinas argues that envy opposes charity, and it's one of the deadly sins because from it you get things like hatred, rejoicing in the failure of others, and purposely trying to harm their reputation. In Purgatorio, Dante writes, "My blood was so afire with envy that when I had seen a man becoming happy, the lividness in me was plain to see." In Dante's poem, envy landed you on the second terrace of Mount Purgatory. The souls here are forced to wear coarse cloaks while having their eyes sewed shut with wire. This prevents them from seeing others, so they're not tempted to be envious of anything that they have. They're now forced to look inward and focus on themselves instead of others, something that, for whatever reason, John Doe just wasn't able to do. It's hard to say if it was premeditated or something that just kind of happened, because we do know he tortured one of his victims for an entire year, which means all of this was at least somewhat planned. And I wonder if he originally planned to find another victim and apply the sin of envy to them, or if envy was something he personally struggled with and knew what his fate would eventually be. While John Doe and Mills are having a conversation, Somerset is running over to try and prevent exactly what he knows is about to happen. By the time he gets there, John Doe starts confessing to what he did to Tracy and the baby inside her that Mills didn't know about. At this point, it's pretty evident what the package is. This is the scene where we get the famous line, "What's in the box?" If you don't know by now, what's in the box is the head of David Mills's wife, Tracy. Mills, who's in a state of shock and processing everything he just learned, has to make a decision: mercy or vengeance. Mercy means that his wife and unborn child would perish in vain. Vengeance means John Doe wins. For Mills, it doesn't matter what he chooses here because evil prevails either way. John Doe wants him to choose vengeance. He wants Mills to embrace the sin of wrath. Wrath, I think, could be the trickiest deadly sin to define because it stems from anger, but in the Summa Theologica, Aquinas makes it clear that not all anger is sinful, and that anger becomes wrath when it stops aligning with reason and justice, like becoming obsessed and clinging to anger because Just like other deadly sins, it consumes you. Wrath leads to other sins like harming others physically or verbally. It kind of seems like all the 7 deadly sins start from a neutral position until they pass the point of reason, and this is when they become capital sins according to Aquinas. On the other hand, Aquinas also considers it a sin to not be angry when it's needed. For example, if refraining from anger permits any sort of evil, think of someone who's being wrongfully attacked, like not getting angry over a bully picking on someone who's disabled and just letting it happen without feeling anything. Dante, again, who was influenced heavily by Aquinas, also made it a point to distinguish anger from wrath. In Purgatorio, he placed the souls guilty of wrath on the 3rd terrace of Mount Purgatory. The people here had to walk around in dense smoke to the point where they can't see. This is a representation of how the wrath on earth blinded them. This continuous darkness starts to give people hallucinations, and what they hallucinate are examples of meekness, which is the virtue that's opposite of wrath, a virtue that we're not going to see from Detective Mills. He gives in, becomes wrath, and takes the life of John Doe in one swift second and then unloads what he has left. This death was so unsatisfying, and Somerset was right. John Doe is a hypocrite. He got the easy way out. He's the only one who didn't suffer for his sin. He got exactly what he wanted. He won.